Thank you very much indeed, John, for the kind introduction, and to you and Martin for the invitation. I'm honoured. Those who go down to the sea in ships, who did business on great waters, they saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens, they go down again to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunken men. They were at their wits' end. They cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were calmed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. This passage from Psalm 107 neatly sums up for me some key aspects of seafaring, which I'd like you to bear in mind during my talk. Those that undertake it are at the mercy of the sea, which can range from those precipitous waves to a mill-pond calm, conditions which can be equally problematic, especially for those that, as in the psalm, seek to do business on great waters rather than simply mess about in boats. The contemporary cultural fascination with seafaring, in this country anyway, similarly ranges from Deadliest Catch, which is I find an absolutely fascinating programme about fishing vessels on the Bering Sea, and they have to catch these crabs in these absolutely Arctic conditions, to Griff Rhys-Jones's recent TV spin-off from Jerome K. Jerome's Three Men in a Boat. A distinction between land and sea bookends the passage. Initially, sailors go down from the land to the sea, and although the calm after the storm is welcome, it's only really when they return to land that they are safe in a haven. The ship, in this context, is merely a carrier. It's a means of transport which provides some protection for the sailors against the elements, which are ultimately beyond their control, governed by God in this context. Understanding the ship as a mobile, enclosed, and somewhat vulnerable entity between land and sea is very much key to the psychology of seafaring. The wider context of this passage, though, perhaps gives a broader idea about the significance of seafaring. For God coming to the aid of those who go down to the sea in ships is set alongside descriptions of those afflicted by famine, captivity, or their own sin. Calming a storm is established here through imagery elsewhere in the Bible as an example of a key redemptive act for mankind when all is otherwise lost. And so seafaring is very much established as a fundamental part of human existence. There's a necessity to do business on great waters. That means battling the waves is inevitable. This psalm doesn't directly make a link between seafaring and music beyond commanding thanksgiving for the Lord's benevolence in terms of songs of joy. But my second example to set off this talk is arguably more pervasive than a psalm in the context of contemporary popular culture, and offers a vivid illustration in which the fragility, a sort of circle of the fragility of human existence, seafaring and music, is completed. So here's a very brief excerpt from James Cameron's 1997 Titanic, a blockbuster film which reaffirms those links between music and the sea in its depiction of a key, if contested, episode within this tragic event. So it's literally a 2-minute excerpt.
Captain, where should I go? Please.
Captain, sir!
That's it then.
Goodbye, Ollie. Good luck.
Goodbye, Bollard.
Take a ton of it, baby.
course, by contrast with Psalm 107, the cries of the afflicted here seemingly go unheeded, but yet it's notable that the musicians remain, uniquely perhaps, steadfast in their work amidst total chaos, acting as much as professional seafarers, perhaps, as professional musicians. Exactly what the musicians played in the face of impending death is subject to debate, but more is known about the Titanic band than any other seafaring musicians as a result of this tragedy. Of course, the links between music and seafaring extend far beyond this well-known episode. Researchers have long been aware of the role of music in connecting cultures, and musical migration has become a focus for study. However, the processes and mechanisms that establish such connections are perhaps less clear. I became interested in the broad area of music and the sea through my study of Black British jazz musicians who came from the port city of Cardiff in Wales, and I'll say a bit more about this later. I also became interested in sailing, and there I am, undertaking many trips off the west coast of Scotland around the Hebrides. And although this was far more luxurious than the passages undertaken in the golden age of shipping, it did give me a flavour of the particular social dynamic on board ship, this self-contained entity in the ocean, the relationship between being at sea and being on land, being set adrift and coming home, and a deeper understanding of the importance of seafaring heritage to an island nation especially. So this morning I'm going to explore my latest thoughts on music and seafaring. Some are quite well formed, some less so, which have developed from a network that I ran with IHRC funding called Atlantic Sounds, Ships and Sailor Towns. The aim of this project was to bring researchers from different disciplines together, as well as researchers from outside academia that are really vital to this project, I think, in the same way as they are for the Musicians' Union project. I should just point out that unlike some others, I'm perhaps less interested in the sea as artistic inspiration and more concerned about the practicalities of music making within maritime environments. My interests revolve around two intersecting axes, which I've identified through my opening examples. That shift, or that continual blurring perhaps, between seafarers and musicians, and the sea as an intermediary between two land-based destinations, if you like. So the sea between the land. And I'm going to explore those kind of axes today through three examples. A musical one, the shanty, one to do with place, the sailor town, and thirdly, one to do with space, the ship. So let's begin with what perhaps might have been in your mind before you even came to this talk, shanties or sea songs more broadly. And there are certainly people far more qualified than I to comment on the long and complex history of singing aboard ship. But in this context of a conference focusing on musical labour, it's perhaps most important to note that music and sailing are inextricable. The shantymen led the singing and therefore was also responsible for the labour. Musical form was also tied to the nature of the work to be done. For example, in Blow the Man Down, we hear a call and response structure where the majority of the crew would be getting ready to make a rhythmic pull to perhaps hoist a sail or something. And I should say I've chosen these recordings for particular reasons, which I'll explain in a moment.
Oh, as I was a-rolling down Paradise Street, scuffer I chance for to make.
Give me some time to blow the man down.
Says he, you're a black baller by the cut of your hair.
Way, blow the man down.
Says he, you're a black baller by the clothes that you wear.
Give me some time to blow the man down.
Oh, you've signed in.
You get the idea. A kind of verse plus chorus form was used for jobs which required a regular steady rhythm, such as winding the capstan, which is a sort of big wheel, winch-like thing, for those of you not familiar with the nautical terms. The song Can't You Dance the Polka has a narrative to ease the boredom of this sort of repetitive labour and a chorus for everybody to join in. This particular shanty tells a sorry tale of a sailor who meets a girl who offers to take him home to her family. He sits down to dinner, is promptly drugged, goes to bed with the girl, and in the morning he awakens to find himself naked without his clothes or his money. I'll play you a snatch of that.
And when we got to barracks
Sorry for the really brief snatches. I can tell you more about the recordings after this. These songs both exemplify the inherent cross-cultural nature of sea music. Blow the Man Down refers to Paradise Street, which is a street in Liverpool, but there are versions of this song that have been collected which refer to streets in other cities, most notably Newcastle. New York Girls focuses on the importation of the polka from Europe to the States, the final lines issuing practical advice to European sailors who may be New York bound. Sailor lads, take warning when you land on New York shore. You have to get up early to be smarter than a whore. Importantly also then, the shanties look forward to the pleasures of land as compared to the hard work and drudgery of being at sea. In their seminal book, Rhythms of Labour, Marek Kosinski, Michael Pickering and Emmett Robertson warn scholars not to focus on the function of sea songs at the expense of the emotional impact that they can have on a workforce and a corresponding rise in productivity. So it's unsurprising, really, that the use of such songs at sea declined alongside increased mechanisation, but it's important to note that this was accompanied by concern for their preservation and impetus for revival. It's possible to identify several specific moments of the revival in the shanty in the UK. The most familiar of these accompanied the decline of the UK's shipping industry around the mid-20th century. It was dominated by the larger-than-life figure of Stan Hugel, who we heard singing Blow the Man Down. Hugel was a former shantyman who ensured the continuation of this musical tradition through his performances and books. And there he is on the left there. But in fact, as the shanty authority, the late Roy Palmer, has pointed out, the idea of reviving a dying art had been a concern by as early as the end of the 19th century. Folk song collectors like Cecil Sharp had made concerted efforts to document shanties, but also make adaptations which included censoring the lyrics and providing piano accompaniments to enable them to be performed on land and even on the concert platform by those who had little or no direct experience of seafaring. Although Hugel's promotion of the connection of the songs with their traditional environment and Sharp's adaptation to allow the material to function on land seem kind of opposite approaches. Essentially, both were aiming at the same thing, to ensure that shanties were not only preserved, but remained relevant in more modern contexts. Over the past few years, I've been studying the most recent manifestation of the shanty revival, focusing on a sea shanty festival which takes place every year in Falmouth in Cornwall. The vast majority of the groups that are featured in this festival were formed in the late 1990s or early 2000s, defining a kind of new phase in the southwest of England, at least in terms of the shanty revival. And I argue there are several reasons for this. Despite Hugel's undisputed legacy, it could be argued that his death in 1992 provided the opportunity for others to develop new approaches to performing this repertoire, which didn't require that intimate connection with the shanty at sea, and in parallel with a more nostalgic view of seafaring more generally. And there was particular groups that provided a direction for this, the Spinners there in the top left, being people that incorporated sea songs within quite a wide-ranging repertoire, and a more recent development being the band Bellowhead that we just heard performing Can't You Dance the Polka, which again absorbs sea songs within a wide-ranging repertoire. Of undeniable and direct importance to this revival is the group The Fisherman's Friends there in the top right. They came to prominence in the 1990s and were signed by Universal Music in 2010. What's really interesting for me about them is that the members were drawn from a particular maritime community, again in Cornwall, Port Isaac, but the individuals demonstrate different connections to the sea. There were seafarers, but also hoteliers, landlords, builders, which really redefines, it responds to that redefinition of what a maritime community is about, and therefore reflected in the songs also. The Friends have been quite prominent. They've been featured in TV adverts and have even been the subject of a documentary, pictured here with Gareth Malone, who many of you will be familiar with, has really led a TV-based renaissance of community singing across the UK, which extends far beyond sea songs, but particularly as focused on the workplace, schools and the workplace. And a final factor, which I hope doesn't seem too frivolous, has been the rise of the most intriguing and glamorous of seafarers, perhaps pirates, via the Pirates of the Caribbean series. And many of my informants speak about the influence that this has had on the way that their music making is perceived, and that sometimes that can be a positive thing and sometimes maybe not so much. Some have gone completely wholesale for the pirate thing. This is a group, the Pirates of St. Piran, and they do really go for it. And that canon actually fires, which is sort of troubling. There are lots of further examples of the ways in which groups have redefined that shanty tradition. Here's an all-female group, for example. that incorporate some of the forms and the call and response and musical features of the shanty, but redefining it from a female perspective. The role of women in seafaring has, I guess, been sort of slightly written out. The history is coming back now, but it's been redefined in terms of them taking the shanty form and using that as a vehicle to provide a female perspective. I think what's really interesting here also is the dress that sort of merges the nautical with the all black of the concert, sort of that blurred function that it's still connected with the sea, but it's something now that has an audience. So I think within the context of music and labour, this most recent shanty revival is interesting as the participants articulate through their performances a tension between the desire to preserve the material as music for work and to make this relevant. And certainly some key features of the historical shanty also continue in a 21st century context. Participants explain how the music provides a basis for forging a sense of local identity, including for incomers, which can then be articulated through these festivals nationally and indeed internationally. So groups often privilege a connection with the original context of this material through their performance practices, including those whooping sounds that you heard in Hugel's performance. And I suppose what's most notable is that function of the shanty as entertainment. And that might seem to be a new phenomenon, but as one of the crews pointed out to me, shanties always existed on one level to entertain the crew, providing a way of dealing with the work in hand. But clearly there's been a shift in that within recent times. So it's clear that the adherence to the tradition of the sea after Hugel and adaptation for performance on the mainland after Sharp remain at play in this most recent revival of the shanty. But importantly, this revival is marked by a high degree of invention, which originally typified shanty performance on board ship. Before I leave this topic, I want to play a final example, and this time it's from a group of youngsters, relatively speaking. It was quite notable for a group of young people to be doing this. It tends to be people of a slightly older generation. And I'd suggest here that perhaps it's the most contemporary shanty of them all that is in fact the best way of preserving the essence of what this music really meant in its original context. So be a very brief snatch of this one.
You make a roadie, boy. I am not a city boy, I'm better off here with my pasty. Hey, pour me a pint of ale any day, I don't want no skinny latte. Oh, hey, up and say, home's where the heart is and I won't stray. Oh, hey, I love this place, but it's a hard life drinking night and day.
They're a group that very much use the shanty as a way of expressing what it means to be a young person in Cornwall, which connects with the redefinition of what the maritime means as well in that context. Certainly its connection with its maritime past has served the town of Falmouth well through various festivals and institutions such as the National Maritime Museum that's based there. The contemporary incorporation of musical material that would have been heard more or less exclusively on board ship into land-based environments has undoubtedly contributed to the blurring of the distinction between shanties and other types of songs associated with seafaring, which were more often sung in port. Historically, ports, or sailor towns, to coin the term again established by Stan Hugel in his 1967 book of that name, demonstrate different links between seafarers, music and labour. But music making in sailor towns was by no means restricted to sea songs, as demonstrated by my work on the port city of Cardiff, which in fact produced the largest group of British-born jazz musicians working in London from any one place outside the capital in the 1930s. And I'm going to talk briefly about that now. Most of the group that I've been studying were born in an area commonly known as Tiger Bay, which encompasses the docks there at the bottom and the area between where the yellow marker is and the river, up to where you might be able to just see where the railway line crosses at the top. So there are some very physical boundaries to that area, the sea and the docks, the river, the railway, the railway along the top, and then there's a big street where the yellow marker is. There's a big long straight street which has a huge wall alongside it, which has been there forever, and it's that very physical sense of this area being kind of bounded off in its physical environment. In the period I'm talking about, the sort of 30s and 40s, 95% of Cardiff's black population lived in this area. It was the Denny's family who provided a centre for the musical life of Tiger Bay in the early 20th century. Antonio Francisco Diniz was a Portuguese sailor from the Cape Verde Islands, and he married Gertrude Boston, who was probably born in Bristol to an African-American father. And they have 5 children, and 3 who survived into adulthood all became musicians. The father played the mandolin, the violin, and the guitar. And there are recollections in the oral histories how they had different instruments stacked around their front room. So it kind of became a music studio, not just for the family, but for the community. Music in Tiger Bay centred around plucked strings, banjo, guitar, mandolin, quatuor, sort of 4-string guitar, and ukulele. It was said to be because these instruments were cheap, but of course they were also portable and crucially were polyphonic, so they could provide a really rich accompaniment for singing. But the most important of all, perhaps, the plucked string instruments were also suitable for rendering the West Indian calypso repertoire that was most in demand by this particular community and was also accessible by imitation from records. And soon these young musicians, the Denny's brothers and their friends, were working regularly in various combinations for house parties in the community, which often celebrated the return of West Indian sailors to port. They were also involved in playing for dances. One musician recalled getting paid 5 shillings for playing at a dance where entrance cost a shilling. But more lucrative by far was being employed by prostitutes to play while they entertained their clients, for which the same musician recalled making 30 shillings and more for playing requests. The young musicians continued in this sort of work when they left school and began full-time employment. And other than going to sea, the employment possibilities for young black people in Cardiff in the 30s were very limited. Music represented a way to earn extra money, as well as an important form of recreation. And quite quickly, the Denny's brothers and their friends developed aspirations towards making a living in the entertainment business. There were various trials and tribulations, but by 1934, there was this significant group of musicians from Cardiff working in London. And the dominance of the West Indian music in their formative years, as a result of the sailor town environment, meant that they had similar musical background to the growing black musical community in London, and they were well placed to succeed. This little sketch demonstrates the importance of music within sailor town economies, which provided work and opportunities to the resident population. But there's another side to this as well. Bute Town, which was its more official name, developed a notorious reputation by as early as the end of the 19th century. Through history, it was the cafes of Bute Town that were the public face of what newspapers reported and therefore the public objected to. Mixed-race relationships, prostitution, drinking, drugs, gambling and crime. And such activities were centred on Bute Street, that long straight street that I mentioned earlier, which was the interface between the town and the port area, and inevitably defined the whole area for outsiders. Music doesn't seem to feature very much in otherwise very fulsome anthropological account by Kenneth Little of the Bay in the 1940s, and it seems to be implicitly aligned via drinking and dancing with the dubious pleasures of Bute Street. But the oral history of these musicians really point towards the importance of music behind closed doors at house parties, a trend that wasn't mentioned in Kenneth Little's work, and the lack of facilities which he identified. He didn't think there was sort of much going on in terms of music, which led the residents of Tiger Bay to make their own entertainment. So Stan Hugel's vivid Sailor Town remains an important text on places like Tiger Bay, but also serves to illustrate the pervasiveness of myth and legend in perceptions of seaport cities. Musical depictions of sailors and sailor towns disseminated these stereotypes, often revolving around masculinity and hypersexuality, both straight and gay, still further. There are many examples, here are just a few. Gilbert Sullivan's late 19th century nautical-themed operettas, through Richard Rogers' South Pacific, Bernstein's On the Town, and perhaps ultimately the musical Anything Goes, which is in fact set on a ship. Not to mention numerous songs from All the Nice Girls Love a Sailor to Village Peoples in the Navy. Here's a slightly lesser-known example, from a midpoint chronologically between these two, performed by Geraldo and his orchestra, one of Britain's most successful band leaders between the wars. I hope you enjoy this one, it's one of my particular favourites.
Yo-ho-ho-ho-ho. Oh, the sailor with the navy blue eyes. Who's the guy they love to buy? Dozens of socks and ties. Yo-ho-ho-ho-ho. Oh, the sailor with the navy blue eyes. When the boat comes home after crossing the foam, he's still at sea, just thinking and wondering, who's he gonna take rowing on the lake? Who's the gob who's got a job, waving the most goodbyes? Yo-ho-ho-ho-ho. Oh, the sailor with the navy blue eyes.
Aside from anything else, I'm just so impressed with the quality of the musicianship there. So if anyone ever says that, you know, British musicians were inferior perhaps to American ones in this period, I think, you know, it's just impeccable and beautiful in its way. So this leads me on kind of neatly, provides a bit of a segue into my final area, which is to talk about ships. After the Second World War, Giraldo ran a booking agency which organised bands for transatlantic liners, establishing what became known as Giraldo's Navy. And I'll sort of explore that and some other interfaces between musicians and on cruise ships and liners in this final section. Ships have been a source of fascination for numerous modern thinkers. Roland Barthes, for example, notes that the ship provides a utopian space of enclosure and self-determination within the unfathomable realm of the oceans. For Foucault, however, the floating space of the ship is a prime manifestation of heterotopia, a space of otherness set apart from either here or there. In Paul Gilroy's influential theorisation of the Black Atlantic, the ship is symbolic of the reality of the Middle Passage. Gilroy also uses the ship, which he terms a living microcultural, micropolitical system in motion, as a starting point for his explorations of transatlantic musical interactions which transcend the boundaries of nation-states, and this, of course, includes music. It's also been noted that the defined or confined space of the ship constitutes close to ideal laboratory conditions for social researchers, and I argue that ships also offer exciting and largely untapped possibilities for musicologists. An important shift in the predominant function of seafaring and consequently the role of music on ships took place during the 20th century. Travel by sea became much less about just getting from place to place and more about the experience of the journey itself, and this has ultimately resulted in cruising as being the prime product of today's shipping lines. As the passenger experience became the focus, entertainment became key and increasingly professionalised. Music was given greater prominence on newly constructed liners in the early 20th century, particularly through the inclusion of ballrooms and everything that entailed. And soon the demand for musicians was met by the Liverpool-based Black Brothers agency, who engaged those ill-fated musicians for the Titanic. But until recently, thinking around the impact of seafaring on the development of music and musicians has remained firmly tied to land, focusing on studying what musicians did when they arrived at their destination, rather than what happened during that sort of formative time of the journey itself. And I have to say that my work has been probably as guilty of that as anybody else's. The history of jazz tends to describe musicians' activities in a huge amount of detail up to the point they embark upon a ship, then there's a big gap, and then that resumes again when they disembark at the other end. One important exception is George Burroughs' work on Fats Waller's interaction with the band on the Queen Mary in 1939, which he argues was formative on the composition of his London suite. So the way in which Giraldo's Navy has found a place within British jazz history is typical of this emphasis of experiences of land over sea. Transatlantic travel had been halted during the Second World War. The ships were stripped out for its use as troop carriers. Refitting and remodelling from 1945 allowed passenger shipping to experience a second flowering of just over a decade before long-haul flight became established as an efficient way of crossing the Atlantic. This coincided with the time when access to American jazz for British musicians was limited by the restrictions on American performers working in the UK, as John and Martin have explored and published what's commonly known as the MU ban, but it is much more complex, in fact, than that. But also the effects of the American recording ban around that time. So playing for a passage with a chance to experience jazz in New York City on arrival was obviously an attractive prospect for British jazz musicians. The liners docked virtually at the end of the fabled 52nd Street. And their experiences in New York were clearly formative. Drummer Tony Crombie commented, "It's not so much hearing it as seeing it live. You got a funny idea what bebop drummers were doing from the records because of the bad balance. You could hear the bass drum punctuations, but the cymbals sounded like surface noise. When you saw people in action, it was a great lesson." As well as Crombie, Ronnie Scott and John Dankworth were amongst the musicians who were part of Gerardo's Navy and in fact played on the maiden voyage of the refitted Queen Mary. And they provide a lot of details about their encounters with Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and others, but the details about what they did on board are disappointingly sort of lacking. Dankworth recalled, "We'd have to play tuneful, simple music that was easy to dance to, although often boring to play. Tunes of the day, such as Time After Time, standards such as Stardust, and waltzes such as I'll See You Again." And eventually, the boredom of playing this sort of repertoire drove even the usually well-behaved Dankworth into mischief-making on board that actually culminated in being fired. And he notes in his book that was the only time he was ever fired from anything. So the reminiscences of seafaring from the stars of modern British jazz are almost bound to represent their employment on ships in this way and to kind of gloss over it. But we know that for many other musicians, hidden through the nature of their employment, the passage of time, and contemporary ideas about the value of this work, seafaring was much more fundamental and often a source of long-term employment. As the passenger shipping industry began to re-establish itself after the war, seafaring enjoyed a high status within the music profession, with changes in ships' orchestras reported regularly in trade periodicals such as Melody Maker. Furthermore, under the auspices of the MU, terms and conditions were radically improved at this time. The subject of seafaring appeared on the agenda for the very first conference after the war in 1945. And new rates of pay were eventually established by 1951. And this was a huge increase. The rate of pay before the war was said to be £8 per month, and that rose to £32 after the war, and then rapidly on upwards after that. In the minutes from around this time, the union also demonstrated awareness about the possibility of musicians being usurped by modern technology. They were particularly concerned about Hammond organs being installed on the new ships, which would cut out the need for a band potentially. So this sort of surfaces periodically. But despite this agreement being reached and this huge raise in the wages around this time, documents from conferences in the 1950s show that musicians remain quite unhappy. They weren't happy that they weren't allowed to mix with the passengers to the same degree that they had been before the war. And it was reported that they found it difficult to accept the position that they entered ships' orchestras as employees, but expected to be treated as passengers. This is really a throwback to the pre-war era, where musicians would sort of travel as a sort of somewhere between a passenger, a crew, and a sort of employee that was separate from all of that altogether. But in fact, they had more or less travelled as passengers and enjoyed the same sort of privileges and being able to interact quite freely. This surfaced again and again and again, and eventually in 1955, it was made clear that at the annual conference that a status that would compare favourably with that of employment in first-class hotels was impossible. And it was pointed out that if the musicians got what they wanted, they would receive privileges that no other seafarers enjoyed, and it would require a complete reorganisation of the disciplinary status within the Merchant Navy, and the matter was therefore dismissed. Although disrupted by 2 world wars, it was the developments in the long-haul air travel which posed the ultimate threat. And initially, the industry faced this competition with further development of shipboard entertainment, but there was a bit of a dip, and then a kind of resurgence around the 1970s until today, where the cruise industry has again been a significant employer of musicians, and entertainment is an expected part of the cruise product. The modern cruise industry, I think, has maybe posed some problems to the MU because it's such a global thing. So anything that is agreed locally is very, very tricky to enforce. Recently, I've been running an online survey for current and recent seafaring musicians, which they've been very forthcoming about, which I think in itself is interesting, that they're maybe not often asked about their working lives. And it's interesting that the same issues of the 1950s continue to surface. In particular, the status of musicians within the hierarchy of the ship, within the wider music profession, and in the public eye, it continues to be kind of problematic. So my informants report what they perceive as being a lack of respect from senior officers as a significant challenge in their working lives on board. They often feel that their high levels of training and skill, the vast majority of my informants are university or conservatoire trained, sometimes to postgraduate level, and 2 or 3 were undertaking doctorates. and they feel that should be better recognised by the superiors. They also report concerns about diminishing quality and numbers of musicians, citing the increasingly common usage of recorded music, such as backing tracks in shipboard entertainment, recalling that concern about the Hammond organ and the effect of that. They worry that this appears to make them superfluous, and some suggest that this results in fewer musicians needing to do more different types of work. So, for example, playing in the show band, which is very much at the heart of the traditional sort of cruise ship entertainment, but also in the lounges and perhaps giving concerts and playing on deck, and they're all being asked to do more different things. Musicians are generally very resistant to having to undertake duties that have nothing to do with being a musician and everything to do with being a seafarer. But yet, the trope of the heroic seafarer musician, as in the Titanic scenario, appears again and again in the history and the reportage of maritime disasters. Examples include the musicians and entertainers that organised the evacuation of the sinking Oceanus, and the musicians who drowned in the Costa Concordia disaster in 2012, which were represented as very much as a contemporary parallel to those of the Titanic within the media. These high-profile situations repeatedly show musicians as being, in some ways, the ultimate seafarers. They seem to flourish as such only in the most desperate of situations, and other times remain largely hidden. When asked about how work at sea is regarded within the music profession, the views of my informants were very mixed. Some argue that it represents an opportunity for steady employment, which is now increasingly rare, especially perhaps within jazz, and has become more respected as a sort of career path or a career part of your career as a result. Others cite the common perception that it's a refuge for those that are unable to make it on land. But it's notable that very few of my respondents cited artistic reasons for going onto the ships. The most common motivations are financial and to travel to see the world. And although the majority felt that their time aboard had been beneficial to their musicianship, this was as much, if not more, through the opportunity and the time for private practice, rather than through any performances that they were employed to give. They often cite the development of skills such as sight reading, band leading, stamina and versatility as being the positive outcomes of things that they've learned. But scratched beneath the surface, and the dystopian reality of musical labour challenges the consistent presentation of seafaring as a utopian ideal. Musicians' testimonies repeatedly articulate the difficulties which result from the confined space of the ship, which is at best a disorientating heterotopia, more likely a dystopian reality. Musicians invariably have to share cabins, resulting in a lack of privacy and personal space. Prolonged conflicts were inevitable due to working and living with the same people in that space. Alcohol is frequently cited as a source of escape, and many warn prospective colleagues of the dangers of addiction to alcohol and other things. Dislocation from land is mentioned as a reason for going onto the ships. For many, it provides an escape from personal and professional difficulties on land, but is also shown to exacerbate these in the long term. It was considered almost unanimously difficult or perhaps even impossible to maintain relationships with those on land while on board, and transient relationships, professionally and personally, were identified as the only likely outcome. So I hope in this talk I've shown various things to do with the shanty, how seafarers were musicians, and then musicians have kind of emulated or imitated seafaring, and the musician, how the material has been reclaimed from work song to use on land, and that connection between sea and seafaring work is reconfigured. Through the sailor town, musicians actually resisting seafaring, but seafaring providing the economic drivers and material for a localised music industry and a basis for musicians' careers. And finally, on the ship, again with musicians resisting that seafaring identity unless in a time of great strife, and the ship redefining in some ways what it means to be a musician and what it means to perform. And so I would conclude by saying it's clear that for those that continue to do business on great waters, the words of that psalm that I quoted continue to ring true, and that nothing can be taken for granted until their desired haven is reached. Thank you.